This video contains a fictional story created exclusively for entertainment and inspiration. This content is not intended for educational purposes. The narrative is original and was developed by a human creator with the support of artificial intelligence tools and creative review. No real events or historical facts are being presented as true. There are evenings in London that exist outside the ordinary passage of time, evenings that press themselves into memory, like a flower between the pages of a beloved book, preserved long after the petals have lost their color. The 23rd of October, in the year of our Lord 1882, was precisely such an evening. The air carried the first real bite of autumn, sharp enough to redden the cheeks of those who lingered too long on the steps of the Royal Opera House, yet not so cruel as to discourage the parade of silk and jewels that flowed through its gilded doors like a river determined to announce itself to the world. London society understood the opera the way it understood most things, not as art, but as theatre of a different kind. The stage inside was almost secondary. The real performance happened in the lobbies, in the private boxes draped with velvet curtains, in the swift, practiced exchange of glances between women who had made the study of one another into a fine and merciless science. To be seen at the opera was to submit oneself to judgment, and the verdict was delivered swiftly, without appeal, and with a cruelty so refined it could pass for politeness in all but the sharpest company. Into this world on that particular evening stepped Miss Emmeline Ashford. She was not the sort of woman who entered a room and commanded it. She did not possess Lady Seraphina Darcy's theatrical beauty, nor the confident carriage of women who had been told since birth that the world owed them its admiration. Emmeline was slender and quiet in the way that certain rivers are quiet, still on the surface but moving with purpose beneath. Her gown was not new. It was her mother's, altered carefully at the seams by Emmeline's own hand over the course of 3 evenings, the ivory silk let out slightly at the waist, the worn hem trimmed and rehemmed so neatly that only someone who looked very closely would notice. She had arranged her dark hair herself, pinning it in a simple style that, had it been attempted by a less naturally graceful woman, might have appeared plain. On Emmeline it looked considered. Her father, Mr. George Ashford, walked beside her with the kind of dignity that belongs only to men who have known genuine hardship and refuse to let it diminish them. He was a tall man, though age had begun to curve his shoulders slightly, and his evening coat, while impeccably brushed, bore the quiet evidence of many seasons of wear. George Ashford had once held a respectable position among the lesser gentry of Hertfordshire, but a series of misfortunes, a failed investment, the costly illness of his wife in her final years, and the particular cruelty of an entailed estate, had reduced his circumstances to something that London society regarded with a mixture of pity and contempt. He was tolerated at the edges of gatherings such as this, because he was, by all accounts, a gentleman in the truest sense of the word. He was never accepted at their centre. Tonight, however, he had done something extraordinary for a man of his means. He had purchased 2 tickets to the opera. Emmeline had not known until 3 days before. He had pressed the small envelope into her hands at breakfast with a smile so tender it had made her throat ache, and she had opened it to find 2 tickets to a performance of Verdi's La Traviata at the Royal Opera House. She had looked up at him with wide eyes, and he had said simply, "Your mother loved Verdi." Nothing more was needed. She had pressed the envelope to her chest and said nothing for a long moment, and the silence between them had been the kind that holds more meaning than most speeches. She thought of that moment now, as they climbed the stone steps, passing beneath the enormous columns of the opera house facade, while carriages continued to disgorge their fashionable passengers behind them. She thought of her mother, a gentle woman with a gift for music and a laugh that had filled whatever room she occupied, and felt her presence as a warmth against the cool of the evening. This was not about impressing anyone. This was not about being seen. This was about carrying a piece of her mother into a place her mother had always wanted to visit and never had the chance. That resolution, so simple and sincere, was already more than most people in that building could claim. They made their way into the grand lobby, and Emmeline allowed herself a single unguarded moment of wonder. The chandeliers above were extraordinary. Hundreds of candles reflected in crystal that scattered light across every surface, turning the cream and gold interior into something that belonged more to dream than reality. Around her, the world of London society swirled in full display. Dowagers moved in slow, stately processions, their jewels catching the light with every step. Young women in their first or second seasons clustered in careful formations, each one acutely aware of being observed, each one performing the delicate balance between appearing at ease and making absolutely certain she was noticed. Gentlemen in evening dress moved through the crowd with varying degrees of intention, some gravitating toward particular groups with the focused energy of men on a social mission, others drifting with the studied casualness of those who wished it to appear that their presence required no effort at all. Emmeline had no group to cluster with. She had no season behind her and no season ahead of her. She had her father's arm and her mother's altered gown, and a pair of tickets to hear music that had been written for the human heart, regardless of the circumstances of the heart's owner. She lifted her chin slightly and let the light of the chandeliers fall across her face without flinching from it, and if anyone in that lobby had been paying attention to the right things, they might have noticed something remarkable about her expression, a quality of genuine openness, of being fully present, that was entirely absent from the faces of nearly everyone else in the room. But of course, almost no one was paying attention to Emmeline Ashford. Almost. Maxwell Devereux, the 6th Duke of Ashworth, stood near the far end of the lobby with the particular stillness of a man who has learned to observe without appearing to do so. He was 34 years old, and he carried his title the way certain men carry their height, without effort, without performance, as simply a fact of their physical reality. He was not the most handsome man in the room in the conventional sense that London society measured such things, but he possessed something that handsome men frequently lack, a quality of complete self-possession that drew the eye without demanding it. His dark hair was touched at the temples with the early suggestion of silver. His expression at rest was cool and somewhat distant, the expression of a man who has been the object of too much attention for too long and has developed a certain careful detachment as a consequence. He had not wanted to come tonight. This admission, had he made it aloud, would have scandalized half of London and delighted the other half. The Duke of Ashworth, declining to attend the opera, the event for which his box had been reserved for 30 years, the event around which much of the season's social manoeuvring revolved, was the kind of thing that would be discussed for weeks. But Maxwell Devereux was 34 years old and had been the Duke of Ashworth for 8 of those years, and he had spent the better part of those 8 years growing increasingly exhausted by the performance that the world expected of him. He was here because his solicitor, Mr. Hartley, had reminded him that his continued absence from public engagements was beginning to generate the kind of speculation that, left unchecked, had a tendency to become inconvenient. He was here because it was, in the strict arithmetic of social obligation, the path of least resistance. He was not here to be impressed, to impress, or to participate in the elaborate courtship rituals that the opera invariably provided cover for. He had been standing in roughly the same position for 11 minutes, accepting the small parade of acquaintances who approached him with varying degrees of subtlety, responding to each with sufficient warmth to satisfy the requirements of civility and no more, when something shifted in his peripheral vision. A young woman in ivory silk, standing near the base of the grand staircase. He might not have looked twice. The lobby was full of young women in evening gowns, and Maxwell Devereux had long since ceased to find the sight remarkable. But something in the way she stood arrested his attention and held it for a moment longer than was usual. She was not performing. That was the thing. Everyone else in that lobby, and Maxwell had become, out of sheer self-preservation, an extraordinarily accurate reader of social performance, was enacting some version of themselves, some carefully assembled presentation calibrated for the specific audience of that evening. This woman was simply standing in the light of the chandeliers and looking up at them with an expression of such unaffected wonder that it made the rest of the room for just a moment seem slightly absurd by comparison. He noted her gown, not new but worn with dignity. He noted the elderly gentleman beside her, whose bearing spoke of a man who had known better days and had not allowed himself to become bitter about it. He noted the absence of any social group around her, the absence of the particular tight anxiety that marked women who feared being seen to be without connection. She did not appear to fear anything of the kind. She appeared, in fact, entirely unconcerned with the question of whether she was being observed, which was, in that particular lobby, on that particular evening, so unusual as to be almost startling. Then the moment passed. Someone addressed him, and he returned his attention to the conversation at hand. But the image of her, that quality of genuine presence in a room full of careful pretense, remained at the edge of his awareness, a small, inexplicable disturbance in an evening he had expected to be entirely predictable. Emmeline did not notice the Duke's glance. She was busy navigating the particular challenge of moving through a crowd that made no effort to accommodate you, the small social cruelty of being invisible to people who could see you perfectly well. She guided her father toward the staircase with a light hand on his arm, exchanging quiet words with him about the architecture, about the music they were about to hear, about a detail of the ceiling fresco that she had read about in a guidebook she had borrowed from the lending library specifically for this occasion. George Ashford's eyes were bright with pleasure, and for that alone the evening was already worth whatever discomfort it brought. It was on the first landing of the grand staircase that Lady Seraphina Darcy appeared. Emmeline had seen Lady Seraphina at perhaps 3 previous gatherings over the course of the last 2 years, gatherings at the periphery of which the Ashfords occasionally found themselves through the kindness of more generous acquaintances. She knew Seraphina by reputation as much as by sight. The daughter of the Earl of Wexbourne, possessed of considerable beauty and considerably more ambition, the unchallenged centre of a particular social circle that prided itself on its exclusivity. Seraphina Darcy was 22 years old and had spent all 22 of those years being admired, and the experience had done nothing to improve her character. Tonight she was wearing deep crimson, which suited her colouring extraordinarily well, and which she was almost certainly aware of. She stood on the landing in a small constellation of companions, 2 young women whose primary social function appeared to be the amplification of Seraphina's opinions, and she was in the middle of a sentence when Emmeline and her father reached the landing. The sentence stopped. Seraphina's eyes travelled over Emmeline with the particular species of contempt that requires no effort because it is entirely genuine, and then moved to George Ashford, and something shifted in her expression, a small, cold crystallization of social calculation. She knew who they were, of course she did. London society, for all its grandeur, was a remarkably small world, and the story of George Ashford's reduced circumstances was precisely the kind of story that circulated efficiently through it. Miss Ashford. Seraphina's voice was perfectly pleasant, which was, of course, the point. Cruelty that announces itself too plainly is merely rude. Cruelty that arrives wrapped in the language of civility is art. How extraordinary to see you here. Lady Seraphina. Emmeline inclined her head with composure she did not entirely feel. Good evening. Indeed. Seraphina let the words settle for a moment, then added with a smile that did not reach her eyes, I don't believe I realized tickets were still available. One does assume these things sell out rather quickly to those who, well. She paused, as if reconsidering a thought too unkind to complete, which of course had the precise effect of completing it more thoroughly than any word could have done. One of her companions pressed her lips together in a suppressed smile. The other examined her glove with sudden, concentrated interest. George Ashford's arm tightened very slightly beneath Emmeline's hand. She felt it, and covered his hand with her own for just a moment, a small invisible gesture of reassurance that Seraphina, even had she been inclined to observe such things, would never have noticed or understood. We are very much looking forward to the performance, Emmeline said. Her voice was even. It cost her something to make it so, but she managed it. Verdi's La Traviata is particularly dear to our family. How charming, Seraphina said, in the tone one uses for things one does not find charming in the least. And then, because she had an audience, and because the audience expected something worth remembering, she added quite clearly, so that the small group around them on the landing could hear it without difficulty. You know, Miss Ashford, some places in this world are designed for particular kinds of people. It is not unkind to acknowledge it. It is simply honest. She tilted her head with a small, practiced smile. "You should not be here." The words fell into a small, terrible silence. Around them, the lobby noise continued its uninterrupted roar, the way the world always continues its noise in the moments that crack open inside individuals and leave them permanently altered. But in the specific radius of the landing, several people had heard. Several pairs of eyes slid toward Emmeline with the particular avid attention that witnessing social humiliation produces in those who are grateful for once not to be the one being humiliated. Emmeline's face did not change. This was not because she felt nothing. She felt a great deal, in the compressed, white-hot way that genuine hurt announces itself before pride can fully intercept it. But she had learned, in a life that had offered its share of instruction in the subject, that allowing others to witness your wound is a gift to them that they have not earned and do not deserve. She held Lady Seraphina's gaze for one steady, composed moment. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "but I am here all the same." She turned, gently guiding her father forward, and they continued up the staircase. She did not look back. She did not allow herself to. Her father said nothing for a long moment, and when he did speak, it was very softly, so that only she could hear. "Your mother would have been proud of you just then." She had to press her lips together very firmly to prevent the response that rose immediately to her eyes. They found their seats, good seats she was surprised to discover in the second tier with a clear view of the stage, and settled in as the house continued to fill around them. Emmeline smoothed her gown across her lap and directed her attention firmly toward the stage below, where the orchestra was beginning its tuning, the individual instruments finding their voices one by one before surrendering them to the larger whole. She loved this moment, the honest chaos of preparation before the performance imposed its order. It felt true in a way that performances rarely did. She breathed, and gradually the heat of the encounter on the staircase began to cool. She was not the only person in the opera house who was not precisely where society thought she ought to be, she told herself. The world was larger than Lady Seraphina Darcy's assessment of it. Verdi had not written La Traviata for women with titles and new gowns. He had written it for anyone with a heart capable of breaking and recovering again. She was qualified. Below, in the grand stalls and in the row of private boxes that curved along the upper tier, the audience was settling. Emmeline allowed her gaze to move along the boxes with idle curiosity. She had read about them, about the families whose names were attached to them in perpetuity, the way certain spaces in London were simply understood to belong to particular people in the way that monuments belong to particular histories. The Ashworth box, the guidebook had noted, had been held by the Devereux family for 3 generations. It was appropriately one of the finest in the house, positioned at the ideal angle from the stage, its curtains a deep midnight blue. She found it without difficulty and noted that it was occupied. The man who sat within it was visible from her position in partial profile, and she could see enough to understand why he was the subject of so much conversation. Maxwell Devereux occupied a space, the way certain geographical features occupied landscapes, not by demanding attention, but by simply being the largest and most consequential thing in the vicinity. He was speaking to a companion beside him with what appeared to be minimal interest, his gaze drifting toward the stage with the look of a man who has come to hear the music and considers everything else that the evening requires of him to be a tax he is resigned to paying. Emmeline looked away. She had not come here to observe dukes. She had come to hear Verdi. The lights began slowly to dim, and in the gathering dark, as the first notes rose from the orchestra pit and filled that extraordinary space with sound that was nothing like what she had imagined from reading about it, nothing like what any description could prepare you for, because music on this scale is a physical experience before it is an intellectual one. Something felt in the chest and behind the eyes, and in the particular hollow of the throat. Emmeline Ashford closed her eyes for just a moment and let it fill her completely. Her father's hand found hers in the dark and she held it. This was why they had come. The first act of La Traviata unfolded with the particular magic of Verdi at his most persuasive, drawing the audience into the warm, doomed world of Violetta and Alfredo, with music that seemed to understand human longing from the inside. Emmeline watched with the complete attention she gave to very few things, her earlier distress retreating steadily before the larger, more demanding reality of the music. She was not thinking about Lady Seraphina. She was not thinking about the whispers on the landing. She was thinking about nothing that could be contained in words, because the music was doing the containing for her. At the interval, the lights rose with the sudden social shock of returning to the ordinary world, and the audience stirred and murmured and began the performance of itself that the intermission demanded. Emmeline blinked, returning from wherever the music had taken her, and found her father regarding her with an expression of quiet, complete happiness. "Well?" she asked softly. "Your mother is here," he said. "I am certain of it." She squeezed his hand and said nothing, because nothing was needed. They made their way out to the corridor during the interval. Her father required some refreshment, and the movement of his joints that sitting still for prolonged periods made necessary. The corridor outside their tier was less crowded than the main lobby, populated primarily by those seeking a moment of relief from the social performance below, and Emmeline walked beside her father with the quiet ease of two people entirely comfortable in each other's company. It was here in this quieter corridor that the evening shifted, continuing seamlessly from where Part 1 ended, still 40,800 words, same fluid narrative voice. "You should not be here." Part 1, continued, final scene. And Part 2, the weight of a single gesture. They had paused near one of the tall windows that overlooked the street below, where the last of the late arrivals were still descending from carriages, their breath visible in small clouds against the cold October air. George Ashford had accepted a glass of lemonade from a passing attendant and was speaking with quiet pleasure about the soprano's performance in the first act. Her phrasing in the aria, "Ah, forse lui," he said, had been extraordinary, and he was right. Emmeline was listening to him and watching the street below with the comfortable half-attention of someone whose mind has been thoroughly satisfied by something beautiful and is not yet ready to surrender that satisfaction to the demands of full awareness. She did not hear the footsteps approaching from down the corridor. She would not have known to listen for them. There was no reason, in any rational accounting of that evening, to expect that those particular footsteps had anything to do with her. "Mr. Ashford." The voice was low and even, and it carried the kind of natural authority that has nothing to do with volume, the authority of a person so thoroughly accustomed to being listened to that raising the voice has never once been necessary. George Ashford turned, and Emmeline turned with him, and she found herself looking at the Duke of Ashworth at a distance of approximately 4 feet, which was considerably closer than she had anticipated ever being to such a person. Up close, he was less immediately imposing than she might have expected from the figure she had observed from across the house, and somehow more so. The coolness she had noted from a distance was present, but there was something beneath it, an attentiveness in his dark eyes that contradicted the indifferent surface in a way she could not immediately resolve. He was looking at her father with an expression that was polite and direct, entirely free of the particular brand of condescension that men of his station frequently deployed without awareness. George Ashford blinked, clearly uncertain whether he was being addressed in error. "Your Grace," he said, with the instinctive courtesy of a man for whom good manners were not performance but habit. "I believe we have a mutual acquaintance in Sir Edmund Hartley," the Duke said. "He has spoken of you on more than one occasion. I understand you have some expertise in classical literature, particularly the Augustan poets." George Ashford's expression shifted through surprise and landed, gratefully, on genuine pleasure. "I have made a study of them, yes, though I would hesitate to claim expertise in the company of those who deserve the title more fully. Hartley is very generous in his descriptions." "He is accurate," the Duke replied, with a brevity that somehow conveyed sincerity rather than curtness. "I've been attempting to locate a reliable commentary on Horace's odes for some months. Hartley suggested you might be the person most likely to have an opinion worth hearing on the subject." It was, Emmeline recognized with a clarity that surprised her, a perfectly constructed opening. It gave her father something to engage with on his own terms, on ground where his reduced circumstances were entirely irrelevant, and his genuine knowledge was the only currency that mattered. Whether the Duke had designed it with that specific purpose in mind, or whether it was simply how he operated, she could not yet determine. But she found herself watching him with a degree of attention that was no longer entirely casual. Her father launched with visible delight into the question of Horace, the competing schools of commentary, his own considerable opinions about which approaches best preserve the musicality of the original Latin, the ways in which translation necessarily sacrificed one fidelity for another. The Duke listened with what appeared to be genuine engagement, asking the occasional question that demonstrated he was not simply being polite, but had an actual working familiarity with the subject. Emmeline stood beside her father and said nothing, content to watch the pleasure that the conversation was bringing him, a pleasure she recognized as rare and therefore precious, the pleasure of a man who has been largely overlooked being suddenly, unexpectedly, taken seriously. After a few minutes, without interrupting her father's current point, the Duke's eyes moved to Emmeline, not with the evaluative sweep that she was accustomed to receiving from people of his world, the swift, comprehensive assessment that calculated social worth as automatically as breathing, with simple attention, as if he was curious, in a direct and uncomplicated way, about what he would find. "Miss Ashford," he said, when her father reached a natural pause, "you have said nothing, which in my experience of literary conversations either means that a person has no opinion or that they are waiting to see whether the conversation is worth contributing to." She met his gaze without looking away, which required a small, conscious effort. "The latter, I think," she said. "My father's knowledge of the Augustan poets far exceeds mine, but I have read Horace, and I have my own views. I would be interested to hear them." She considered for a moment, aware that she was being tested in some way, though not in the hostile way that Lady Seraphina's eyes had tested her on the staircase. This was different. This was the test of genuine curiosity, which is both more forgiving and in its way more demanding. "I think the most important thing about Horace is that he understood the difference between what endures and what merely lasts," she said. "A great deal of what he wrote about, the small pleasures, the specific moments, the private joys against public ambition, feels true in a way that monuments don't. Monuments last. Truth endures. They are not always the same thing." A silence followed her words, brief but of a particular quality. Her father turned to look at her with an expression she recognized as pride. The Duke was quiet for a moment, in a way that felt like consideration rather than dismissal. "That is a more useful distinction than anything I have read in 3 volumes of commentary," he said. She felt color rise in her face and was grateful that the corridor lighting, warm and slightly dim, was unlikely to betray it. "You are very kind, Your Grace." "I am very rarely kind," he said. "I am occasionally honest. In this case, the two coincide." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one, the suggestion of a warmth that the rest of his face had not yet agreed to. "Are you enjoying the performance?" "Very much," she said, and then, because the evening had already been extraordinary enough to make the truth seem worth offering, "More than I expected, and I expected a great deal. My mother loved Verdi. She never had the opportunity to hear him performed on this scale. I suppose tonight is, in part, for her." She had not intended to say that last part. It came out of the same place as her Horace observation, the place that functioned honestly before the social editor could intervene. She felt a brief flash of self-consciousness about it, the exposure of having said something real to someone who was, by any measure, a stranger. But he did not receive it as an oversharing of sentiment from someone who should have known better. He received it quietly, with the gravity that genuine things deserve. "Then I hope the second act fulfills what the first has begun," he said. There was something in his voice on those words, a note she could not quite identify, something that lived between courtesy and something warmer. The bell sounded from below, calling the audience back for the second act. George Ashford finished his lemonade with the slight reluctance of a man who has been enjoying himself and is not entirely ready to stop, and the Duke inclined his head toward both of them with the kind of genuine courtesy that is rarer than its performance. "Mr. Ashford, I would very much welcome the opportunity to continue this conversation at some point, if you would permit me to call." George Ashford looked for a single unguarded moment, as if he had not expected to be asked such a thing, and then recovered with perfect composure. "We would be honored, Your Grace." The Duke's eyes moved very briefly to Emmeline once more. "Good evening, Miss Ashford." "Good evening, Your Grace." He turned and walked back down the corridor toward the Ashworth box, and Emmeline stood beside her father and watched the Opera House corridor for a moment with the peculiar suspended feeling of someone who has experienced something that does not yet fully make sense. Her father said with great restraint nothing at all until they had returned to their seats. Then, under cover of the orchestra's opening notes of the second act, he leaned toward her and murmured, "Well, don't," she whispered back. "I said nothing." "You were about to say a great deal." He smiled into the darkness and said no more. The music began again, and Emmeline turned her eyes to the stage, though her attention, that complete, singular attention she had given so freely to the first act, was now somewhat less simple than it had been. Something had shifted in the architecture of the evening, and she could not yet determine whether it was significant or simply the result of an unusual encounter in a corridor, the kind that occasionally happened and then dissolved entirely back into the ordinary run of days. She told herself it was the latter. She was quite practiced at telling herself sensible things. She was not entirely successful. The second act of La Traviata unfolded its tragedy with the relentless inevitability of great music. Violetta's sacrifice, Alfredo's misunderstanding, the gathering shadow of illness and social consequence that would bring everything beautiful to its end. Emmeline watched and felt, and let the music do what music does when you are willing to let it. Open the places you keep carefully managed and remind you, with tremendous gentleness, that feeling deeply is not a weakness, but a form of precision. By the time the final act brought its devastating conclusion, Violetta dying with Alfredo's name on her lips, the love that had cost everything still worth having cost it, there were tears on Emmeline's face that she did not bother to conceal, because in a darkened opera house tears are not a vulnerability but a tribute, and no one who had genuinely heard what she had just heard could possibly fault the response. Her father's hand was in hers again. His cheeks, she noted, were not entirely dry either. When the lights came up and the applause broke out, they sat for a long moment before joining it, because some things require a breath before you can return to the world. Then they clapped with everyone else, and Emmeline looked at the stage with genuine gratitude. For the singers, for Verdi, for the specific miracle that music represents, this incomprehensible human achievement of turning feeling into organized sound and giving it back to strangers. They gathered themselves to leave with the slow, comfortable pace of people who are in no hurry to relinquish an experience. The crowd thickened as they moved toward the exits, the grand staircase filling with the departing audience in a glittering, slow-moving river. Emmeline and her father descended with it, and she was aware, in the pleasant exhaustion that followed a powerful emotional experience, of very little beyond the warmth of her father's arm and the fading resonance of the music still moving through her. She became aware of the whispers before she fully understood their direction. It began as a general elevation in the murmur around them, a slight specific shift in the quality of the crowd's attention, the collective intake of a group that has noticed something worth noticing. Emmeline did not immediately register that it had anything to do with her. Then she heard her name, not loudly but clearly, from somewhere on the staircase slightly above and behind them. "The Ashford girl, can you imagine?" "He spoke with them during the interval, I'm told, the Duke himself. Serafina must be absolutely—" "Well, I suppose he can speak to whoever he likes. It means nothing." She kept her eyes forward and her expression neutral, and she did not increase her pace because increasing one's pace under those circumstances is an admission, and she had not admitted anything all evening and was not about to begin. Beside her, her father heard it too. She knew by the slight squaring of his shoulders that same quiet dignity with which he bore everything that life required him to bear. She loved him for it with a fierceness that tightened her throat. They had nearly reached the bottom of the staircase when the crowd shifted in that particular way that crowds shift when someone of consequence is moving through them, a parting, a stepping back, the unconscious deference of bodies that recognize rank before the mind has processed the information. Emmeline moved to the side automatically, making room, and found herself standing at the base of the staircase, as Maxwell Devereux descended from the upper corridor with his companion, an older gentleman she did not recognize, and reached the bottom step. He could have passed without acknowledgement. It would have been, by the strict accounting of social convention, entirely appropriate. They had spoken in a corridor during the interval. That required no public continuation, and there were 40 people in the immediate vicinity who would have noted any continuation with the avid interest of those who understand that dukes do not acknowledge obscure young women in ivory gowns without reason. He did not pass without acknowledgement. He stopped. He turned toward her and her father with the full, unhurried attention of a man who is entirely aware of what he is doing and has decided to do it anyway. He inclined his head to George Ashford with the specific, unmistakable courtesy of one gentleman acknowledging another as an equal, not as a charity, not as a condescension, but as a simple recognition of shared standing in the most fundamental sense. Then he looked at Emmeline, and in front of 40 people on the grand staircase of the Royal Opera House, with Seraphina Darcy watching from perhaps 15 feet away with an expression that had gone very still and very white, he said clearly and with perfect composure, "Miss Ashford, I wonder if you and your father might permit me to see you to your carriage. The crowd at the door can be disagreeable at this hour, and I know a quieter exit." The silence that followed was the kind that vibrates, George Ashford said with complete dignity. "You are very kind, Your Grace." And Emmeline, whose heart was doing something that she absolutely refused to acknowledge it was doing, met the Duke's gaze with the composure she had spent the better part of the evening carefully maintaining, and said, "Thank you." Maxwell Devereux offered his arm, not to her but to her father, which was the correct and considerate thing, and which somehow made the gesture more rather than less significant, and walked with them through a side corridor that did, in fact, lead to a quieter exit, where the night air was cold and clean and the crowd had not yet reached. He spoke to her father about Horace for the 3 minutes it took them to reach the door, and he arranged for them to be assisted into a hired cab with the easy efficiency of a man for whom arranging things is simply a matter of deciding that they should be arranged. Before the cab door closed, he looked at Emmeline once more. "I hope Verdi gave you what you came for," he said. She thought of her mother. She thought of her father's hand in hers in the dark. She thought of the music filling all the spaces that ordinary life left empty. "More than I came for," she said honestly, "as is sometimes the way with the best things." He said nothing to that. But something in his eyes, that particular quality of attention that she had first noticed in the corridor, the look of a man who is not expected to find something, and finds it anyway, deepened in a way that she felt in the center of her chest before she fully understood it in her mind. The cab moved off into the London night, and Emmeline Ashford sat beside her father in the dark and looked out at the lit streets passing by and told herself, with all the firm practicality she could assemble, that it was simply a kind gesture by an influential man toward a woman who had been publicly slighted in a house where he was the highest authority, and that she should feel gratitude, and nothing more complicated than gratitude, and that she should certainly not feel the particular warmth in her sternum that she was currently inconveniently, undeniably feeling. Her father said nothing until they had been in the cab for several minutes. Then, very quietly, with a gentleness so perfect that she could not even begin to be annoyed by it, "Your mother would have found him interesting." Emmeline turned to look at him in the shadowed interior of the cab. He was looking out the opposite window with an expression of studied neutrality that did not deceive her for a single moment. "Go to sleep, Papa," she said. He smiled and said no more, and the London streets carried them home through the October dark while the music still moved through her, and something new, nameless yet but present, the way a season is present before it has declared itself, began very quietly to stir. 3 days after the opera, Mr. Hartley called. He arrived at the Ashfords' modest townhouse in Bloomsbury on a Tuesday morning, when the autumn rain was doing its best to make London feel as grey as possible, and was received in the small front parlour where Emmeline had been mending a curtain with the quiet industry of a person who has learned to find satisfaction in useful work. She set the curtain aside and received the solicitor with tea and the composed courtesy that was her default register in unfamiliar situations. Mr. Edmund Hartley was a small, precise man of perhaps 60, with the kind of face that had probably always looked slightly older than it was, as though he had been born with the dignified weathering of a man who has spent decades managing the affairs of the complicated and the powerful. He had been George Ashford's solicitor in the years of better circumstances, and had remained out of what Emmeline suspected was genuine fondness rather than professional obligation, connected to the family as their circumstances changed. He accepted his tea and spoke first about general matters, the legal question of the small property in Hertfordshire that still technically bore the Ashford name, the status of a minor investment that had not yet fully resolved itself. Emmeline listened and responded and waited, because she had learned to recognize when conversation was building towards something, and this conversation was building. "His Grace the Duke of Ashworth," Hartley said eventually, setting his cup down with care, "has asked me to convey his interest in renewing the acquaintance he made with your father at the opera last week. He suggested, if it would be acceptable, a call at his convenience, perhaps Thursday." Emmeline looked at him steadily. "That is very considerate of His Grace." Hartley's expression did not change, but his eyes, which were quite sharp beneath their mild surface, moved over her face with brief but thorough attention. "He is a man of unusual consideration," Hartley said. "In my experience of him, which spans nearly 15 years, he does not make gestures without purpose. He is also—" A small pause. "Not a man who makes gestures lightly." Emmeline was quite certain she understood what he was not saying, and equally certain that the correct response was to continue not saying it. "My father will be very pleased to see him," she said. "He has been looking forward to continuing their conversation about the Augustan poets." "Indeed," said Hartley with perfect neutrality. "I will convey that to His Grace." After he left, Emmeline stood in the front parlour for a moment with the mended curtain in her hands, and the rain against the window, and the particular feeling of standing at the precise edge of something whose dimensions were not yet clear. She was not a woman who indulged in fantasy. She had been raised in circumstances that made practical thinking not just virtuous but necessary, and she had cultivated an honest relationship with reality that she was deeply reluctant to abandon for the seductive unreliability of hope. But she was also, underneath all of that, a woman who had sat in the dark and wept at Verdi, and felt music as a physical truth, and who had stood in a corridor and said something honest about Horace to a stranger, and had it received as if it mattered, and those were not facts she could entirely set aside. She went back to her mending. She was very thorough about it. On Thursday, the Duke of Ashworth called. He arrived at 11 o'clock precisely, which was what she would have expected. He was received by both Ashfords in the front parlour, where Emmeline had arranged flowers from the small market on the corner, not elaborately, just enough to make the room look like a place where care was taken, which it was. She wore her second-best afternoon dress, which was dark blue wool and suited her well, and she had told herself firmly that morning that she was under no obligation to read significance into anything, and that the morning would go precisely as well as she allowed it to, and not otherwise. Maxwell Devereux walked into the modest Bloomsbury parlour with the same quality of complete self-possession he had carried through the opera house. But something in it was different here, and it took her a moment to identify the difference. In the opera, he had moved through a space that was designed for people like him, a space that confirmed his world at every surface. Here, in a small room with second-hand furniture and carefully mended curtains and flowers from a market stall, there was no confirmation. There was just a room, and he sat in it without any apparent difficulty, accepting his tea with the same ease he might have accepted it in a ducal drawing-room, which told her something about him that she filed carefully away. He and her father talked about Horace for nearly 40 minutes. It was a genuine conversation. She had half expected the Duke to deploy the subject as a polite frame for some other purpose, but he clearly had real interest and real opinions, and her father clearly had more of both, and they went at each other with the pleasant vigour of two people who have found a sparring partner worth the effort. Emmeline contributed occasionally, sharp, specific observations that she offered when she had something real to add and withheld otherwise, and each time she spoke, the Duke listened with that same focused quality of attention that she had first noticed in the opera house corridor, the quality that suggested your words were being genuinely received rather than simply waited through. When the conversation eventually moved from Horace to more general territory, the state of the season, a recent exhibition at the National Gallery, the qualities of the current production at Drury Lane, something relaxed slightly in the room, the pleasant loosening that follows a period of real mental engagement. Her father excused himself briefly, the unmistakable maneuver of a parent who has decided to create an opportunity and is not particularly concerned about whether it is subtle. Emmeline did not look at the door through which he had gone. She poured more tea and kept her expression composed. "Your father is an exceptional man," the Duke said. His voice was quieter now, in the smaller space with only one other person in it. "He is," she said. "He has always been more exceptional than his circumstances have reflected. That is not an unusual situation, I think." "No," he agreed. "It is not." A brief silence. The rain had continued through the morning, and the window behind Emmeline gave the room its light, grey and soft and oddly intimate. "Miss Ashford, I want to say something that I am uncertain how to say without appearing to overstep." She looked at him. He was looking at her with a directness that was somewhat disconcerting in its honesty, as though he had decided the usual social intermediaries were more trouble than they were worth. "I appreciate directness," she said, "considerably more than its alternatives." Something, that almost smile again, moved across his face. "I am aware of what was said to you on the staircase at the opera," he said. "I was not near enough to hear it directly, but one need not hear such things directly. They are always repeated. I want you to understand that my speaking with you that evening, and my calling today, has nothing to do with rectifying any social slight. I am not in the habit of social charity, and I do not imagine you would welcome it if I were." She held his gaze. Her heart was doing the thing she was refusing to acknowledge again, but her voice was perfectly steady. "No," she said, "I would not." "Good," he said. "Then we understand each other on that point." He set down his cup with the same careful precision she had noted in Hartley, though for different reasons. "What I would like you to understand is that I found the conversation in the corridor and the observation about endurance versus duration more genuinely interesting than anything I had heard in the preceding 3 months of social engagements. That is the actual reason I am here." The rain moved against the window. Emmeline looked at this man, this Duke, this person whose entire world was constructed from materials so different from hers that they might have occupied separate planets, and felt the ground beneath the conversation shift very slightly, the way ground shifts in the moment before something grows from it. "That is a considerable span of time to have heard nothing interesting," she said. "It is," he said. "London is full of intelligent people performing intelligence. It is quite rare to find someone simply exercising it." She thought about what to say to that, and decided on the truth. "I have never had the luxury of performing," she said. "Performance requires a surplus. I have generally operated closer to the margin." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What you said about your mother at the opera, that you came partly for her." She had not expected him to return to that. "Yes. My own mother died when I was 19, he said. It was not a bid for sympathy. His tone was simply matter of fact, in the way that people speak of things they have fully absorbed and no longer need to protect. She loved music. I found myself thinking of that during the second act." She looked at him, and the calculation she had been doing, the careful, self-protective arithmetic of distance and probability, and the wisdom of not feeling things she had no grounds to feel, paused, because underneath all of it, underneath the title and the social machinery and the careful self-possession that he had developed for reasons she was beginning to understand, there was simply a man who had lost his mother and still went to the opera and still heard the music and thought of her. That was a language she spoke fluently. "She would have found La Traviata fitting, I imagine," Emmeline said gently. "It understands that losing things does not make them less real." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had preceded it. It had a texture. It occupied the room with more weight than silences usually carry, the weight of two people who have understood each other in some fundamental way that will not entirely undo itself. Her father returned from whatever errand he had invented for himself, and the conversation resumed its more general register, and eventually the Duke took his leave with the correct formalities, and the suggestion, made to her father, but with his eyes briefly on her, that he hoped they would permit him to call again. After the front door closed, George Ashford stood in the parlour doorway with an expression of such carefully maintained neutrality that Emmeline almost laughed. "Before you say anything," she said, turning back to the window. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said. "You are incapable of saying nothing on this subject." "I was simply going to observe," he said, "that he stayed for 2 hours." Emmeline looked out at the rain. The streets of Bloomsbury were wet and quiet and entirely ordinary, and something in her chest was warm in a way that the grey afternoon had no business producing. "He did," she said, "and that the man clearly has not had a conversation that interested him in 3 months." "So he said." A pause. Then, with the gentleness that was her father's most powerful weapon, "Emmy, you are allowed to let good things happen." She did not answer him right away. She looked at the rain and thought about what endures versus what merely lasts, and about the specific quality of being seen clearly by someone who had no obligation to look. She thought about all the sensible reasons to be careful, and she thought about Violetta, and about how Verdi understood that love is not less worth having for being difficult, and about the warmth in the room when he had said, "I found the conversation more genuinely interesting than anything I had heard in 3 months. "I know, Papa," she said finally. And the rain fell on, and the London afternoon turned quietly toward evening, and somewhere across the city in a house considerably grander than this one, a man sat at his desk and found, for the first time in quite some time, that his thoughts would not arrange themselves in the orderly fashion he required of them. There is a particular kind of silence that follows an extraordinary evening. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of fullness, the quiet of a vessel that has been filled past its ordinary capacity and needs time to settle before it can be examined. Emmeline Ashford knew that silence well by the morning after the opera. She had woken early, before the autumn light had fully committed itself to the day, and had lain in the narrow bed of her modest room, listening to the sounds of the house coming slowly to life around her. The distant creak of pipes, the muffled footsteps of Mrs. Beale, the housekeeper, beginning her morning rituals below, and had stared at the ceiling with the feeling of someone who has been altered by something and is not yet certain in what precise way. She was a practical woman. She had always been a practical woman because circumstances had required it of her from an early age, and because she had discovered that practicality, properly understood, was not the opposite of feeling, but its most useful companion. She did not mistake the events of the previous evening for something they were not. A man of the Duke of Ashworth's standing had been courteous to her in a public setting. He had spoken with her father, whom he knew through a mutual connection, about a subject of genuine shared interest. He had seen them to a quieter exit as an act of simple consideration. These were the facts, and they were sufficient, and she had assembled them carefully in her mind before she rose and dressed and went down to make her father's breakfast, because assembling facts carefully was how she managed the space between what had happened and what she was in danger of allowing herself to feel about it. She was moderately successful at this. By the time her father appeared in the kitchen doorway, she had the kettle on, and a clear head and no particular evidence of internal disturbance visible on her face. Her father, who had known her for all 23 years of her life and was not deceived by any of it, said good morning and sat down and said absolutely nothing about the opera or its aftermath, which was, she recognized, the most sophisticated conversational strategy available to him, and therefore slightly infuriating. They had porridge and talked about the weather and the state of the coal supply, and whether the book her father had ordered from Hatchard's 3 weeks ago was likely to arrive before the month was out. It was an entirely ordinary morning, and Emmeline was grateful for it. But the thing that had been stirred the night before did not unstir itself, simply because she applied practicality to it. It continued its quiet activity in the background of her days, the way a fire continues to produce heat even when you are not looking at it. When Mr. Hartley called 3 days later, she received the news of the Duke's intended visit with composure that she was genuinely proud of. When Thursday arrived and Maxwell Devereux walked into the small Bloomsbury parlour, she felt the composure tested in the specific way that composure is tested when the thing it is managing turns out to be more substantial than anticipated. He was the same man she had met at the opera, and yet in the daylight and the domestic scale of their own home, Something about him was both more accessible and more complicated. At the opera, he had existed within the opera's frame. The grand house, the candlelight, the social theatre that provided context for everything within it. Here, in a room with second-hand furniture and carefully mended curtains, he had no frame but himself, and himself was, she was discovering, a great deal more than the title that preceded him everywhere he went. The conversation about Horace had been real, not the performance of intellectual interest, but the actual exercise of it. She had watched him with her father, and had seen the specific quality of attention that belongs to a person genuinely engaged, rather than merely appearing to be. He pushed back against her father's arguments with precision, and received her father's counter-arguments with equal seriousness, and the conversation had the alive, slightly competitive energy of two people who respect each other enough to disagree productively. She had contributed when she had something worth saying, and had been listened to when she did, and the listening had been the kind that she could not entirely dismiss as courtesy, because courtesy does not produce that specific quality of focus, the quality of someone taking in your words as information, rather than simply as sound. When her father had excused himself, and the room had reduced itself to two people and the rain against the window, the conversation had shifted into territory she had not anticipated. She had expected, if she was honest, some form of the social performance she associated with men of his class. The careful deployment of charm as a tool, the practiced ease that suggested warmth without risking it. What she had received instead was directness, and the directness had been, paradoxically, far more disarming than any charm could have been. I am not in the habit of social charity, and I do not imagine you would welcome it if I were. No, she would not. And the fact that he knew that, had assessed her clearly enough to know that, after two brief encounters, told her something she could not set neatly aside. She thought about all of this on Friday morning, while she walked to the lending library, because walking was the activity that allowed her mind to work most honestly. The streets of Bloomsbury were damp and smelled of coal smoke and rain-wet stone, and she walked with her coat buttoned against the chill, and her thoughts arranged in a line that she was attempting, with partial success, to keep orderly. The situation was this. A man of extraordinary rank and means had expressed genuine interest in her company and her mind. This was not, she reminded herself, the same as expressing interest in her. It was the beginning of an acquaintance, nothing more and nothing less. And to build anything upon it beyond what the facts supported would be to commit the particular folly of people who see what they wish to see rather than what is. She had known women who had done this, who had assembled a great romance from a handful of kind words and a gentleman's habitual courtesy, and she had watched the subsequent disappointment with sympathy and a firm private resolution not to replicate it. At the same time, and here was where the line of her thoughts refused to stay orderly, at the same time he had said he found her more genuinely interesting than anything he had encountered in 3 months. He had come to Bloomsbury on a Thursday morning, when there were any number of more socially profitable ways to spend a Thursday morning. He had spoken about his mother in a way that suggested he did not speak about his mother to many people. These were not the behaviors of a man performing courtesy. These were the behaviors of a man doing something he had chosen to do because he wanted to do it. She reached the lending library and spent 20 minutes selecting a book she would probably not concentrate on sufficiently to enjoy, and walked home in the continuing drizzle, and told herself, for perhaps the 40th time since Tuesday, that she was going to think about something else. She was moderately unsuccessful at this as well. The Duke of Ashworth, meanwhile, was having his own difficulties with the question of orderly thinking. Maxwell Devereux had been, for the better part of his adult life, a man who operated from a position of deliberate control. This was not a natural state. He had arrived at it through the specific education that his particular life had provided, the education of becoming the Duke of Ashworth at 26 upon his father's unexpected death, of inheriting not just a title and estates, but a web of social, financial, and political obligations that had required him to become competent very quickly at a very wide range of things. He had met this requirement without complaint, because complaint served no practical purpose, and had discovered in the process that the discipline of managing his external world was usefully applied to managing his internal one. He did not, as a rule, find his thoughts drifting. When they did drift, he redirected them with the same efficiency he applied to other problems. It was a system that had served him adequately for 8 years, and he had no particular reason to question it. Except that since Thursday morning in Bloomsbury, the system had been performing below its usual standard. He sat in his study on Friday evening, a high-ceilinged room lined with books, lit by the fire and by the 2 lamps on his desk, surrounded by the comfortable authority of a space that had been precisely arranged to his requirements, and found that the papers before him were receiving considerably less of his attention than they warranted. This was not because the papers were unimportant. They were, in the aggregate, quite important. They concerned the management of 3 estates, the details of a parliamentary position he had been asked to consider, and the ongoing question of a charitable foundation his mother had established before her death that he was attempting to expand into meaningful use. They were not, however, about Horace, or about the question of what endures versus what merely lasts, or about a young woman in a dark blue wool dress who looked at you as if she was thinking about what you had just said, rather than simply waiting to respond to it. He set down his pen. This was, he recognized, a situation that required the same honest assessment he applied to other situations, stripped of sentiment, examined clearly, addressed practically. The facts were these. He had encountered a woman of no social standing and no fortune who possessed an intelligence and a quality of genuine presence that he had found, in 2 brief encounters, more engaging than the combined social efforts of the entirety of his usual world. He had gone to Bloomsbury partly on the pretext of Hartley's introduction, and partly because he had wanted to understand whether what he had observed at the opera was a product of the opera's particular atmosphere or something that existed independently of it. It existed independently of it. This had been established with reasonable certainty by Thursday morning. She was precisely as he had perceived her to be in the opera house corridor, direct, honest, unsentimental in the best possible sense, possessed of a mind that moved quickly and precisely, and was entirely unconcerned with the performance of quickness and precision. She had made him laugh, not outright, not in the obvious way, but in the internal way that manifests as a quality of lightness in a room, a sense that the air has adjusted itself slightly in response to something true being said. He had not experienced that particular quality in conversation for longer than he could comfortably recall. He was 34 years old. He had been, for the last several years, subjected to the determined attentions of a significant portion of marriageable London, and none of those attentions had produced anything beyond a steady, weary exhaustion. He had assumed, with the bleak practicality that long experience teaches, that this was simply the condition of his particular life, that the title and the attendant expectations had made genuine connection effectively impossible, that the women who pursued him pursued the Duke and had no particular interest in the man, and that the man was therefore not particularly available to be interested in. He picked up his pen again and looked at the papers and set the pen back down. It was inconvenient, he thought. It was inconvenient in approximately 14 specific and identifiable ways. She had no family connection that would make the acquaintance easy to explain. She had no fortune that would provide a social justification. Society had already noted his gestures at the opera and at the exit, and was in the process of constructing the narrative it preferred, regardless of what the facts actually were. Lady Seraphina Darcy, who had made her own intentions regarding the Duke of Ashworth quite clear over the course of the past season, had looked, in the brief moment he had observed her on the staircase as he walked with the Ashfords, as though she was composing a response that would require careful navigation. He was aware of all of this. He had been aware of all of this at the moment he had offered his arm to George Ashford at the base of the staircase, which is to say he had assessed it, weighed it, and decided that it was less important than the other thing. The simple fact of a woman who had been publicly told she should not be there, who had responded to that verdict with quiet, unbending dignity, and who deserved someone to indicate, in clear and public terms, that the verdict was wrong. That much had been uncomplicated. The complication was everything that had followed. The conversation in the corridor, the call on Thursday, the specific quality of sitting in a modest Bloomsbury parlour in the rain and feeling, for the first time in a very long time, entirely at ease. He reopened the paper concerning the charitable foundation and applied himself to it with genuine determination. He was moderately successful. The second call came the following Tuesday, and this time he brought Hartley with him, which provided a suitable social structure for a visit that might otherwise have generated commentary. Emmeline observed the arrangement with some amusement and some appreciation. It was the consideration of a man who understood the mechanics of her position and was attempting to make them less difficult, and she was grateful for it, without allowing herself to be excessively touched by it. The four of them took tea in the parlour, and the conversation ranged across several subjects. The recent developments in electrical illumination, which her father found fascinating from a theoretical standpoint, and Hartley found alarming from a practical one. A new translation of Virgil that had recently been published to considerable debate among scholars. The question of what constituted a genuinely useful charitable institution versus one that satisfied the giver more than it served the recipient, a subject on which both Emmeline and the Duke had strong opinions that did not entirely coincide. "You think the structure of giving is inherently paternalistic," the Duke said. He was not challenging her. He was genuinely engaging with the argument, and she could tell the difference. "I think it frequently is," she said. "The assumption that resources are best allocated by those who have them rather than those who need them is one that benefits from examination. People who have spent their lives in scarcity generally have a more precise understanding of where aid is actually useful than those observing from outside." That argument could be extended to suggest that those with resources should simply transfer them without condition, he said, which creates its own difficulties. "I'm not suggesting without structure," she said. "I'm suggesting without assumption. There's a meaningful difference between saying, 'We will help you in the way we believe is best,' and 'we will ask you what is needed and build accordingly.' The first is charity, the second is something closer to respect." A brief silence. Hartley was looking at his teacup with the expression of a man who has learned to appear oblivious in interesting situations. Her father was watching the exchange with the unconcealed interest of a person attending a very good performance. "You are right," the Duke said. It was said without qualification or diminishment, the direct acknowledgement of someone who changes position because the argument warrants it rather than because he wishes to appear agreeable. "The foundation my mother established has operated largely on the first model, which is why it has produced adequate results rather than exceptional ones. I have been trying to understand what the revision should look like." "Talk to the people it serves," Emmeline said simply. "They will tell you." He looked at her with that quality of attention again, steady, genuine, the look of a man storing information rather than simply receiving it. "Yes," he said, "I imagine they will." After the visit, after Hartley and the Duke had taken their leave with the appropriate formalities and the appropriate suggestion of future calls, Emmeline stood at the window and watched the street with the feeling she was becoming accustomed to, the particular combination of stimulation and disquiet that followed any encounter with Maxwell Devereux, the sense of having been more fully present than usual and consequently more fully tired. She heard her father come to stand beside her. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the same unremarkable stretch of Bloomsbury Street. "He is changing the foundation," he said. "He was going to change it anyway. We simply talked about how." "He changed it because you told him to." "I offered an argument. He agreed with it. That is not the same as being told." Her father made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "Emmy, that man has been surrounded by people who agree with him since he was 26 years old. He does not change position in conversation. I have known Edmund Hartley for a decade, and Hartley has never once seen him change position in conversation." A pause. "He changed position today within 4 minutes." Emmeline looked at the street and said nothing. "You are allowed to let good things happen," her father said again, as gently as before. "I'm aware of that, Papa. You are also allowed to trust that some things are what they appear to be." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the expression he reserved for the moments when he was saying the most important things in the quietest possible way, an expression that reminded her always of her mother, because her mother had possessed the same quality of gentleness that carried weight. "I'm trying," she said. "I know," he said. "You are very good at a great many things. Trusting the future is not yet among them. He patted her hand once, firmly. Give it time. 3 weeks after the opera, London society had arrived at several conclusions about the situation, all of which circulated with the efficient energy of a world that runs on observation and inference. The first conclusion was that the Duke of Ashworth was pursuing Miss Emmeline Ashford of Bloomsbury, daughter of the once respectable and now reduced George Ashford, for reasons that ranged from the sympathetically romantic to the improbably cynical, depending on who was doing the concluding. The second conclusion was that this was unprecedented, irregular, and, in the opinion of a significant faction, not to be encouraged. The third conclusion, universally shared, was that Lady Seraphina Darcy was furious about it, which provided a considerable supplementary incentive for the conversation to continue. Seraphina Darcy had spent the better part of the past season constructing what she considered an unassailable position. She was beautiful, titled, possessed of a fortune that was not quite ducal but was entirely respectable, and she had cultivated the Duke's acquaintance through every available avenue with the patient, practiced determination of someone who considers a goal simply a matter of sufficient applied effort. That Maxwell Devereux had shown no particular inclination to respond was a difficulty she had attributed to his general social detachment and had fully intended to address as the season progressed. The opera had been, in her precise assessment, a catastrophe. Not because of anything dramatic, she was too intelligent to overstate, but because she had watched the Duke stop on the staircase and acknowledge the Ashford woman with a clarity of intention that she recognized immediately. And the recognition had produced in her a cold, focused anger that she had been managing carefully ever since. She was not accustomed to competition from quarters she had not considered worth considering. She addressed the situation the way she addressed most situations, with intelligence, patience, and the particular resources available to a woman in her position. She spoke to her mother, who spoke to relevant people, and within a week the social temperature around the Ashfords had shifted slightly. Subtle things, the failure of certain invitations to arrive, the slight coolness of certain previously warm acquaintances, the specific social signal that indicates someone with influence, has indicated a preference. It was not overt. It was never overt with Seraphina, but it was consistent, and in a world as small and interconnected as theirs, consistency was sufficient. Emmeline was not unaware of this. She had good social perception. She had needed it, living at the edges of a world that made its opinions known primarily through implication, and she felt the shift the way one feels a change in weather before the clouds fully arrive. She said nothing about it to her father, who was happy and whose happiness she was not going to disturb with worries she could not yet confirm. She said nothing about it to the Duke either, on the occasion of his next call, which was the first time he had called without Hartley. She had registered that immediately, and had spent the first 10 minutes of the visit maintaining a perfectly normal conversation while a separate, parallel part of her mind noted the absence and what it might mean, and reminded her firmly that she had decided to deal in facts rather than implications. He had brought a book. This was, she discovered, one of his habits. He arrived with a book the way other men arrived with flowers, apparently, and she found it more appealing than flowers would have been, which told her something about herself that she already knew. The book was a volume of Keats, and he handed it to her without ceremony, saying that Hartley had mentioned she frequented the lending library and that he had thought she might prefer to have her own copy of this particular one. She looked at the book and then at him. He was watching her with an expression she was beginning to learn to read, the expression that appeared when he had done something he was slightly uncertain about, but had decided to do anyway. "Thank you," she said. "This is very kind." "It is very practical," he said. "Libraries charge by the day." She laughed, actually laughed, a brief, genuine sound that surprised her slightly by how easily it came. He looked for a moment as if the sound had done something to the room's atmosphere that he had not entirely anticipated, and then his expression settled back into its usual, composed register, though with the faint warmth around the eyes that she had learned to look for. They talked for 2 hours, or her father was present for most of it, and absent for a carefully constructed portion, and in the portion of his absence, the conversation moved through Keats, and through the question of the charitable foundation, and through a brief, careful passage in which the Duke said, with the directness that was becoming familiar, that he was aware the social environment around her had shifted recently, and that he wanted her to know it would be addressed. She looked at him. "You don't need to—" "I am aware I don't need to," he said. "I intend to regardless." She held his gaze for a moment, because there was something she needed to say, and she was going to say it. "I don't want to be defended," she said. "I am capable of managing my own situation. What I would object to is any action taken in a way that treats this as a conflict to be won rather than a—" She paused, finding the word. "Rather than what it actually is," he said quietly. The sentence completed itself between them in the silence that followed, and neither of them said anything more about it, because some things, once accurately named in the space between two people, do not require elaboration. Her father returned with tea he had somehow contrived to brew at a symbolically perfect moment, and they resumed the general conversation, and the Duke took his leave at 4 o'clock with the suggestion, addressed to George Ashford, with his eyes briefly elsewhere, that he hoped they might permit him to escort them to the gallery exhibition at the National on Thursday. After he left, Emmeline stood in the parlour with the volume of Keats in her hands and the feeling of the afternoon around her, like something physical, and her father said nothing at all for a long moment. Then he said what it actually is. "Papa, I merely observed." "You are doing considerably more than observing." "I am a father," he said. "Observing with feeling is the job description." He came to stand beside her and looked at the book in her hands with an expression of transparent happiness that she could not, even slightly, be annoyed by. "Emmy, he brought you Keats." "I noticed. The man owns 3 estates and a library that Hartley tells me has over 4,000 volumes, and he went to a bookshop and bought you Keats." She looked down at the book. The cover was well made but not ostentatious, chosen with attention rather than display. Someone had known which edition. "I know," she said. "What are you afraid of?" her father asked, not unkindly, with the precision of someone who loves you enough to ask the actual question. She considered it honestly because it deserved an honest answer. "That it is exactly what it appears to be," she said at last, "and that the world will not allow it." Her father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The world has tried to tell us a great many things about who we are and where we belong. We are still here." She looked at him, this man who had lost so much and remained so whole, and felt the truth of it settle in her chest alongside everything else that was living there, the music and the rain and the conversations and the particular look in a pair of dark eyes when she said something worth saying. "We are still here," she agreed. Outside, London continued its perpetual indifferent noise, and the afternoon moved toward evening, and somewhere in a study across the city, a man who had spent 8 years being perfectly controlled was sitting with his work unfinished in front of him, and a quality of warmth in his chest that he was finally beginning to stop trying to explain away. The world had not yet finished deciding what it thought about this. There were forces assembling themselves with the patient determination of those who believe social order is a thing worth defending. There were conversations being had in drawing rooms that Emmeline would never be invited to enter. There were decisions approaching that would require more courage than either of them had yet been called upon to demonstrate. But on a Thursday afternoon in Bloomsbury, a woman held a volume of Keats and allowed herself, finally and fully, to feel what she felt. And across the city, a man allowed himself the same. And that, between two people in a world designed to keep them apart, was where everything real begins. There is a moment in every great love story, not the dramatic moment, not the one that announces itself with theatrical flourish, but the quiet one, the moment that arrives without warning in the middle of an ordinary afternoon and says simply, "This is it. This is the thing. You will not find anything truer than this." The moment does not ask permission, and it does not wait for circumstances to be convenient, and it does not concern itself with the opinions of the world arranged around it. It simply arrives, and you either recognize it or you spend the rest of your life wondering what you missed. Emmeline Ashford recognized it on a Wednesday morning in November, 5 weeks after the opera, in the middle of a conversation about nothing in particular. They were walking in Regent's Park, she and her father and the Duke, a promenade that had been arranged with sufficient social structure to satisfy the requirements of propriety, accompanied by Hartley and a distant cousin of the Duke's named Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, who was a comfortable woman of 50 with kind eyes and no apparent inclination to make anyone feel unwelcome. The November air was sharp and smelled of dead leaves and the particular clean cold of a city preparing itself for winter, and the park was beautiful in the stripped, honest way of late autumn, the trees bare, the sky a high, pale grey, the paths quiet with the absence of summer's crowds. They had been talking about the exhibition they had attended at the National Gallery the previous Thursday, a collection of Dutch masters that had prompted a lively disagreement between Emmeline and the Duke about the question of whether technical virtuosity and emotional truth were complementary qualities or competing ones. Emmeline had argued that they were most powerful when inseparable, and the Duke had argued that the greatest technical achievement could produce a kind of cold perfection that was actually antithetical to feeling, and they had not, after 40 minutes of vigorous engagement with the question, arrived at agreement which had suited both of them entirely. The subject had continued across 3 days and 2 letters. He had written, she had replied, he had responded, and it was continuing now in the park, and at some point in the middle of his articulation of a point about Vermeer and the particular quality of light as an emotional rather than technical device, Emmeline found herself looking at him with the thought arriving in her mind with complete and unhurried certainty. I am in love with this man. It was not a thought accompanied by panic which surprised her. She had expected, if such a thought ever arrived, to feel the ground shifting dangerously beneath her. Instead, the ground felt entirely solid, as though the thought was simply confirming a state of affairs that had already established itself without requiring her acknowledgement. The feeling was as clear and as natural as the cold air and the bare trees. Something real, properly itself, without performance or apology. She continued the conversation about Vermeer without missing a beat. She was a practical woman. The feeling could be recognized and carried simultaneously with the maintenance of a rational discussion about Dutch painting. These were not contradictory activities, but she was aware in a new way of the specific quality of the November light on his face as he spoke, of the slight energy that entered his voice when he was engaged with a subject that interested him, of the way he occasionally paused before making a point. A brief silence that she had learned meant he was assembling his argument with care rather than simply producing whatever came first. Of the way he listened to her, actually listened with the full attention of someone for whom what she said was genuinely the most interesting thing happening at that moment, which in a world that had consistently treated her as a person to be looked through rather than looked at, was still, even now after weeks of it, somewhat extraordinary. Her father was walking ahead with Hartley, deep in a conversation about Virgil that had been ongoing in various forms for the better part of a month. Mrs. Thornton had drifted slightly behind, engaged with the scenery, with the easy pleasure of a woman who genuinely enjoys a park in November. The 4 of them occupied the path in a comfortable arrangement that had entirely naturally left Emmeline and the Duke slightly apart from the others, not so far as to occasion comment, but sufficient to permit the conversation its own space. "You've gone quiet," he said in the tone he used when he was not accusatory but curious. "I was thinking about Vermeer," she said, which was approximately a third true. He looked at her with the expression she had privately named his assessment look, the one that meant he was seeing more than she had shown him and was deciding what to do with the information. He had, she had discovered over the past weeks, an extremely accurate social perception that he deployed with considerable selectivity. He did not comment on most of what he observed. He waited. "I was thinking," she said with the directness she had decided was always the better policy with him, "about the question of what endures. You cited Vermeer as an example of technical achievement potentially working against emotional truth. But I think the reason Vermeer endures, specifically, particularly him, is precisely because the technical mastery is so complete that it disappears. You stop seeing the technique. You see only the light, only the woman reading the letter, only the feeling. The craft becomes invisible in service of the truth." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a different argument than the one you were making at the gallery." "I've been thinking about it for 3 days. I know I read your letters. Something in the way he said it, simply without emphasis, as though the fact of having read her letters was entirely ordinary and not the thing she had spent parts of 3 evenings being more aware of than she strictly needed to be, settled in her chest with the particular warmth she was now well acquainted with. "Do you think that's possible?" he asked. "That craft can genuinely disappear in service of truth, or does it always leave a trace?" "I think the best things always leave a trace," she said, "but the trace is the truth, not the technique. When something is done well enough, the how and the what become the same thing." He was looking at her in a way she had not seen before. Or perhaps she had seen it and had been too carefully managed in her own responses to fully receive it. It was not the assessment look. It was something quieter and more direct, something that did not appear to be managing itself at all, which was, given what she knew of him, a significant departure. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Yes." A pause, in which the path and the bare trees and the pale grey sky continued their patient existence. "I find that I have been thinking for the past several weeks, with a degree of frequency and intensity that I am unused to, about the question of what the correct course of action is in a situation that has no precedent in my experience." He paused again, and she had the impression of someone choosing words with unusual care, not for performance, but for accuracy. "I am not, by temperament, a man who acts without understanding where the action leads. I find myself, for the first time in a significant while, uncertain of where something leads, and entirely disinclined to let the uncertainty stop me." She kept her eyes on the path ahead, because if she looked at him directly at this moment, she was not entirely confident in her composure. "That is a very precise way of saying something," she said. "I am a very precise person." "I know." A beat. "So am I." "Then you understand," he said, "that I am telling you something real. Not something performed, not something calculated for effect, something simply true." She did look at him then. The November light was falling across his face, and his expression was for once entirely unguarded. The careful detachment that he wore as a kind of permanent weather had retreated, and what was beneath it was simply a person, a man of 34, who had spent too long in a world of performance and had found in a small Bloomsbury parlour on a rainy Thursday something that felt like relief. "I understand," she said quietly, "and I want you to know that I—" She stopped and found the words, because they deserved to be found. "I am not here because of what you are. I want to be clear about that, because I imagine it is something you need to hear clearly and not by implication." "Yes," he said, "it is. I am here because of you, the person in the conversation, the man who reads Horace and disagrees with me about Dutch painting and changes his position when the argument warrants it, and brought me Keats." She paused. "I am here because of what endures, not what merely lasts." The silence that followed belonged to both of them equally. Ahead on the path, her father and Hartley continued their conversation about Virgil, and Mrs. Thornton admired a particularly fine oak, and the park went about its quiet November business, and neither Emmeline nor the Duke said anything further on the subject, because there was nothing further that needed saying at that precise moment. The understanding had arrived, and it was complete, and it did not need more words to be real. But something had changed in the quality of the air between them, the way air changes in the moment after lightning, clarified, charged, the world somehow more itself than it had been a moment before. What the world thought of it arrived with considerably more noise. The social consequence that Emmeline had anticipated began to manifest in earnest in the second week of November, when an invitation arrived, unprecedented and therefore immediately significant, to a musical evening at the home of Lady Pemberton, who was among the most senior and influential figures in the social world that mattered to the Duke of Ashworth's circle. The invitation was addressed to both Emmeline and her father, and it was written in terms that were cordially unmistakable. Lady Pemberton, who had known the Duke since his childhood, and whose opinion of events carried the specific weight of established authority, was extending a welcome. Emmeline understood immediately what it meant. So did her father, who held the invitation and said nothing for a long moment before setting it on the table with the careful precision of someone handling a thing of consequence. "He arranged this," she said. Almost certainly, her father agreed. Without telling me. He knows you well enough to know you would have objected. She sat with this for a moment. She was not entirely pleased about it, and she was not entirely displeased, and the combination was both complicated and fair. He had acted without consulting her, which was the kind of thing she needed to address directly. He had also, in addressing it, demonstrated a knowledge of her precise situation and a willingness to use his position on her behalf in the way that protection, properly offered, is used, not to diminish the person being protected, but to clear the space in which they can stand on their own terms. She thought about what he had said in the park. I find myself entirely disinclined to let the uncertainty stop me. She wrote him a note that evening. It said, I am aware of what you have done, and I intend to speak to you about the principle of consulting me before acting on my behalf. I am also aware of why you did it, and I find myself unable to be entirely ungrateful, which is inconvenient. We should discuss both. She signed it with her name and sent it with their housekeeper's nephew, who ran errands of this kind for a penny and asked no questions. His response arrived the following morning. It said, You are entirely right on both counts. I look forward to the discussion. I also confess I have been consulting your father, who suggested I not wait for a convenient moment to present itself, as in his experience, convenient moments require assistance. I'm not certain whether this constitutes a mitigating factor or an aggravation. She read it twice and permitted herself a smile that no one was present to observe. The evening at Lady Pemberton's was not without its difficulties. Seraphina Darcy was present, which Emmeline had expected and prepared herself for, and the room contained several people who had heard the whispers from the opera and had formed their conclusions accordingly, and there were moments in the first half-hour that required every resource of composure she possessed. But Lady Pemberton was a woman who had survived 60 years of social London with her dignity and her sense of humour intact, and she received the Ashfords with the specific, deliberate warmth of someone who has decided something and intends to communicate it clearly. She spoke with George Ashford about his work for 10 minutes in the centre of the room, in full view of everyone, and the message this sent through the assembled company was received with the efficiency of a well-aimed signal. Maxwell arrived 20 minutes after the Ashfords. She thought he had timed it, and later he confirmed that he had, and moved through the room with his usual composed authority, exchanging the necessary civilities, and made his way eventually to where Emmeline was standing near the fireplace with a cup of tea and the expression of a person who is entirely comfortable in a situation and is not performing it. He stopped beside her without ceremony. "You look well," he said quietly. "Are you timed your arrival?" she said equally quietly. "I did. To see how I managed the room alone. To give you the opportunity to manage it on your own terms before I arrived and the room began attending to us rather than to you." She considered this. It was, she decided, both managing and considerate, which seemed to be his preferred mode of operating, and which she was finding increasingly difficult to object to, though she intended to keep trying. "The principle of consultation stands," she said. "Acknowledged," he said. "I'm consulting you now. The Viscount Harrington wishes to speak with your father about the Hertfordshire property, which has apparently generated some interest as a potential site for a project your father would find worthwhile. I would like to facilitate that introduction. Do I have your permission?" She looked at him. He was watching her with the patient, clear attention that she had come to understand was his version of warmth. The attention of a person for whom care is expressed most accurately through precision rather than sentiment. "Yes," she said. "Thank you for asking." "I am a fast learner," he said, and the almost smile appeared, and she felt it in her chest in the way she had stopped pretending she didn't. The evening proceeded. Lady Pemberton's musical entertainment was excellent. A pianist and a soprano, who performed with the kind of genuine skill that reminded Emmeline of the opera, of Verdi, of the night that had started all of this, and she sat in the comfortable chair she had been directed to, and listened with the full attention she gave to music, and felt the room around her settle into something more familiar, more manageable. Her father was in conversation with the Viscount, and appeared genuinely engaged. Mrs. Thornton had appeared from somewhere, and was sitting nearby with the pleasant solidarity of a person who has decided to make herself available as a social buffer, and is entirely comfortable in the role. Serafina Darcy had looked at her exactly once during the evening, a long assessing look across the room, not hostile in any obvious way, but clear. Emmeline had met it steadily, and had then returned her attention to the music, because there was nothing useful to be communicated in that particular exchange, and the music was better worth attending to. Serafina had looked away first, and the matter for the evening was concluded. It was Hartley who told her 3 days later about the full extent of what the Duke had done. He came to call on a Friday morning with the air of a man who has information he considers it his duty to communicate, and is not entirely certain how it will be received. He told her over tea that the Duke had spoken privately with the Earl of Wexbourne, Serafina's father, about the comments made on the staircase at the opera. He had not made threats. He had not issued ultimatums. He had simply made it known, in terms that were entirely civil and entirely clear, that Miss Emmeline Ashford was under his protection in the social sense of that phrase, that any further public discourtesy directed toward her would be noted, and that the Earl might wish to ensure his daughter understood the position. Emmeline listened to this with the particular stillness of someone whose feelings are moving too quickly for expression. "He did not tell me," she said. "No," Hartley said. "He told me to tell you. He said he knew you would need to decide how you felt about it before you spoke to him, and that he preferred you to have that space." She sat with it for a long moment. The fire was burning low, and the morning was grey outside, and the house was quiet around her. "He is the most thoroughly managing person I have ever encountered," she said finally. "He is," Hartley agreed with a slight smile. "He is also, in my 15 years of knowing him, the most thoroughly changed by a person that I have ever seen him be. I thought you should know that as well." She looked at the fire. She thought about what endures. She thought about a man who had sat in a modest Bloomsbury parlour and changed position in conversation because the argument was worth it, and who had brought Keats, and who had written her letters about Dutch painting, and who had, with characteristic precision and complete disregard for whether it was convenient, walked across a grand staircase and offered her a place at his side in front of everyone who had decided she should not have one. She thought about what her father had said. "You are allowed to let good things happen." She thought about the music in the dark and her mother, and the particular feeling of being seen clearly by someone who had no obligation to look. She wrote him a letter that afternoon. It was short, because the important things rarely require many words when you are writing to someone who listens properly. It said, "I have spoken with Hartley. I understand what you did, and I understand why, and I understand that you expected me to need time before I said anything about it, which is itself a kind of knowing that I find I am no longer trying to hold at a distance. I would like to see you, not for Horace, not for Dutch painting, for the conversation that has no subject except that it is the one I would choose above any other. I believe you know what I mean." She sealed it and sent it, and then sat in the parlour with the quiet certainty of someone who has stopped arguing with the truth and allowed it to settle fully into place. He came the following morning, not in the afternoon, with the proper social interval that a formal call required. In the morning at 10 o'clock, with no Hartley and no social architecture, just himself at the front door with his hat in his hand, and an expression that was, for the first time since she had known him, entirely without its customary management. She received him in the parlour. Her father was there for exactly 5 minutes, and then he remembered an errand of unspecified urgency, and excused himself with the transparent happiness of a man whose plans are proceeding exactly as he hoped. They sat across from each other in the small room, and the November light came through the window, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that belongs to people who have learned each other well enough to occupy a quiet space together without filling it. "Your letter," he said. "Yes." "You said the conversation has no subject except that it is the one you would choose above any other." "I did say that. I have been trying to understand," he said, with the careful precision she knew and loved, "how to say what I want to say in a way that is honest, without being so imprecise as to be useless. I have been accustomed to having things clearly in front of me before I act on them. This is the first time I have found myself willing to act on something that I cannot yet fully see, because what I can see is—" he paused, "because what I can see is sufficient, more than sufficient. She held his gaze. "Then say the thing you mean," she said gently. "I will receive it honestly." He looked at her. This man who had been Duke for 8 years and alone for most of them, who had built a careful, controlled world and had found it, in the space of 5 weeks, entirely insufficient against the particular fact of her, and said with a simplicity that made it more rather than less, "I love you, Miss Ashford. I am aware of the considerable irregularity of the situation, and I am aware that what I am proposing, because I am proposing something with your permission, will require both of us to navigate a world that has opinions about what is possible. I am not asking you to ignore that. I am asking you to navigate it with me, because I find that the world is substantially more interesting with you in it, and I do not see any practical reason to accept a version of it in which you are not." The fire crackled. The November morning pressed its pale light through the window. Emmeline Ashford looked at the Duke of Ashworth and felt the truth of the past 5 weeks arrange itself fully and permanently into place. The music and the conversations and the letters and the park and the Keats and the patient, specific way of being known by someone who chose to know you. "I love you," she said simply. "That is the complete answer. The rest is detail, and I am not afraid of detail." Something happened in his face that she had not seen before, a complete and unguarded opening, the look of a man receiving something he had not been certain he would receive, and feeling, in the receiving of it, the specific relief of someone who has been holding something carefully for a very long time and has finally been offered a place to set it down. He crossed the room, 3 steps unhurried, and took her hand in both of his, and she looked up at him in the morning light, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because they were both people who understood that some things are more real in the silence. "The detail," he said finally, "will include a conversation with your father, which I intend to have today, and a great deal of patience with the world's adjustment to the situation, and almost certainly some continued disagreement about Dutch painting." "I expect so," she said. "I haven't changed my position on Vermeer." "I know," he said, and the warmth in his eyes was complete and unmanaged and entirely itself. "I find I would not have it any different." George Ashford, when the Duke spoke to him that afternoon, with the formality the occasion required, and the sincerity that was by now entirely characteristic, sat quietly for a long moment after the question was asked. Then he looked at this man, this powerful, careful, thoroughly altered man who had walked into his daughter's life and been made better by the walking, and said simply, "She has always deserved this. I am glad the world has finally agreed." The engagement was announced 3 weeks later in November, in the terms that society required. The response was varied, as expected. There were those who found it romantic. There were those who found it irregular. There were those who could not decide and therefore reserved judgment, which in London social terms is itself a kind of position. Seraphina Darcy said nothing publicly. She was by all accounts brief and civil when the matter was mentioned in her presence, which was the response of an intelligent woman who understood that the situation had been decided, and that the only dignified thing was to accept that understanding. She was too proud to be seen to have lost, which meant she chose to appear as though the matter had never concerned her greatly in the first place. It was not entirely convincing to those who had watched the opera evening closely. It was sufficient for public purposes, and public purposes were what Seraphina had always managed best. On the evening of the announcement, Emmeline sat in the parlour with her father, and they drank a glass of the decent sherry that had been saved for a notable occasion, and George Ashford raised his glass and said, "To your mother, who always believed the world contained more good than it showed at first." Emmeline raised her glass. "To Mamma," she said. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and the fire burned, and the London night pressed around the small house in Bloomsbury that had been home to a great deal of dignity and not quite enough of anything else, and Emmeline thought about how a single evening, a borrowed gown and a Verdi opera, and a father who had saved for months to make a dream real, had altered the entire course of her life, not because she had gone to be seen or to compete or to capture the attention of the most desirable man in London, but because she had gone to feel, because she had stood in the light of the chandeliers and not pretended to be anything other than exactly herself, and that, precisely that, had been the only thing that was ever needed. What Lady Seraphina had meant as a wound had become the exact moment from which everything real had grown. You should not be here. And yet, here she was. Here she remained, and everything that endured, as opposed to merely lasting, had begun with the simple, radical act of refusing to believe that she didn't belong. Some dreams arrive wearing evening gowns, and some arrive in borrowed silk with a mended hem. The world will always have its opinions about where you belong and what you deserve. It will whisper its verdicts in grand staircases and gilded lobbies, and it will expect you to believe them. But the most powerful thing a person can do, the thing that changes everything, is to walk forward anyway. To stand in the light and feel what is real and refuse to apologize for being present in your own life. Emmeline did not win because she was chosen by someone powerful. She won because she never stopped being fully honestly herself, and that is a victory that belongs to no one but the person who earns it. Whatever room you have been told you should not be in, walk in, sit down, and let the music begin. And so, dear friends, we arrive at the end of our story, but perhaps for you the beginning of something. If this story touched your heart the way Emmeline's touched ours, if you felt her courage in your chest and her love in your bones, then you already know what beautiful things feel like when they are real. You deserve more of them. Come back for more stories just like this one. Stories of love that endures, of dignity that holds, of hearts that choose to stay open even when the world suggests otherwise. If this story moved you, please leave a like. It takes just 1 second, and it means the world to this channel. Leave a comment telling me which moment was your favorite. Was it the staircase, the park, the letter? I would truly love to know. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do, so you never miss a story like this one. And if you would like to go a little further and support this work, check the pinned comment below. There you will find a link where you can buy me a coffee. Every cup helps keep these stories coming, and I'm grateful from the bottom of my heart for every single one of you who chooses to be here. Until next time, thank you for listening, thank you for feeling, and remember, you absolutely should be here.